The Hidden Mask by Guise Mitford. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25. The ex-detective paid a visit to the nunnery upon each of the following 3 days. On the first 2 occasions he arrived in the morning, spending a couple of hours alone in the rooms which had already been shown to him by Clayton. On the 3rd day he reached the house in the evening after dinner, and he was accompanied by Dr. Ferguson. There was little change in his manner, though possibly it had become more reserved, and he absolutely refused to answer any questions put to him either by Clayton or McLean. In reply to their anxious inquiries as to the success of his investigations, he always gave the same answer. "You must wait till I have found out all there is to know, and then I shall tell you everything." The expression of the mild blue eyes was absolutely non-committal, and betrayed neither disappointment nor elation. If the world-famed detective had discovered any clue to the murder, he resolutely kept it to himself. His behavior was sometimes brusque, even to rudeness, but he evidently much appreciated the assistance which was so willingly given to him by Clayton and his friend. It was a dark, gusty night when he paid his 3rd visit to the nunnery, and both he and the doctor looked blue with cold as they were shown into the hall by Madame Gaston, Emile's wife, who, with a niece of her husband's, were the only 2 servants in the house. Clayton and Athol McLean were sitting smoking beside the fire, which blazed up the chimney in front of them, when they heard the sound of the approaching car. Madame Gaston was crossing the hall on her way from the dining-room when the door-bell clanged through the silent house. "Here is our friend, come to pay us another visit," McLean said, as he rose from his chair. "I wish he would be a little more communicative. I suppose he is all right, but he gives no signs of having got much forwarder over this wretched business." "It is best to leave him to work out his investigations in his own way," Clayton replied, also rising. "My opinion is that if he had not got something to go upon, he would have given up the job before now. I suppose men in his profession are trained to become secretive. It grows to be second nature to them." Then the door opened, and Dr. Ferguson stepped into the light from the outer darkness. He was soon followed by Greatorex. The 2 men were heavily covered with snow, and stamped their feet on the mat as they entered the house, more to restore their chilled circulation than to relieve themselves of the frozen moisture that fell from their shoulders. "Well done, Doctor," McLean exclaimed, as he shook the outstretched hand. "It is sporting of you to come out on a night like this." Dr. Ferguson smiled pleasantly at the welcome, but McLean noticed a strained look in his eyes as he did so. It was the look of a man who had been keeping late hours given to keen study and not to dissipation, and his voice sounded grave as he returned the pressure upon his palm. "I hope this is the first and the last time my friend will pay you so informal a call," he said. "As I have a night off from my professional duties, I thought I would accompany him. In fact, he asked me to do so." Greatorex, having handed his coat and hat to Madame Gaston, had moved to the fire, where he stood holding out his hands to the friendly blaze. Hot refreshments were speedily procured for the arrivals, but Greatorex remained faithful to his hot water. The doctor took a little brandy in his drink, and his example was followed by McLean and Clayton. "I have brought Dr. Ferguson with me tonight," Greatorex said, "so that I may explain to him the nature and result of my investigations. As he has already told you, there are 2 distinct aspects from which a case of this kind must be regarded. There is the view held by the expert police officer, to which I have devoted a good deal of my time and thought during the last few days. There is also the medical aspect, upon which I wish to consult my friend here. That is my excuse for troubling him to accompany me tonight." "No trouble at all, I assure you," the doctor said. "Will you have dinner?" Clayton asked, "or have you already dined?" "Many thanks," Ferguson replied, shaking his head, "and we had our evening meal before we left Ardleigh, and I dare say there will be something hot waiting for us when we get home." Clayton turned to Greatorex, who was still warming himself in front of the fire. "Then you propose to take the doctor over the house," he said, "at least over those parts associated with the murder?" "Yes. I must ask you to let us do so alone. There are only 1 or 2 rooms I wish to show him. Yours happens to be one of them, also Mr. Moreland's. I suppose there is no objection to us visiting them?" "Certainly not." "Of course, we shall also want to see the apartment in which the crime was committed. Is the door open, or shall we need a key?" "You will find all those rooms available for your inspection," Clayton answered, "and if I can be of any further assistance to you, please let me know." Clayton and his friend resumed their seats beside the fire, while Greatorex and the doctor ascended the staircase to the gloomy landing and gallery overhead. As the sound of their footsteps died away in the distance, McLean emptied his pipe and carefully refilled it and lit it. "I believe that old human bloodhound has got hold of the scent at last," he said, as he puffed great clouds of smoke from his lips. "He would not have brought the doctor here at this time of night for nothing." "I devoutly hope he has," Clayton replied seriously. "I have an idea that, if he is unable to do anything, this crime will be handed down as one more addition to the long list of unexplained tragedies in this country. The unfortunate part of the whole business is the incredulity of everybody with regard to the actual existence of the dwarf in connection with these murders. You know, Ethel, you yourself were very skeptical about the whole affair till you saw him." "My dear fellow, I grant all that, but you must admit that your statements appeared so fantastic and so improbable that it was only by such an ocular demonstration that anybody could accept them as the truth. I now feel much as you must have felt before the night of the murder. I saw the little devil with my own eyes, and I swear I was not drunk at the time, yet nobody will believe my story, supported as it is by yourself. That old fool of a coroner did not pretend to hide his doubts, and of course the jury supported him." A door overhead was gently opened and as gently closed again. Soft as was the sound, it reached the 2 men downstairs with uncanny distinctness. "I wonder how long they will be," McLean said. "Greatorex must know every detail of those rooms by this time. No doubt the doctor wishes to be informed of every theory and suggestion that has occurred to the trained mind of his friend. It was he who proposed that Greatorex should be asked to come here." "Does Moreland know this is going on?" "No, he does not. He was very much upset by the whole affair, and I do not want to trouble him further in the matter till there is something definite to report." "I suppose he has no objection to me staying on at the nunnery?" McLean asked. "My time has not been entirely idle, for, in spite of Miss Rossiter's absence, I have been able to put in a good amount of work at her portrait. Lawrence, my boy, I do not mind telling you, but that picture is the best of its kind I have ever done." "It is a wonderful likeness," Clayton said, "though I do not profess to be any sort of critic. You could not have produced a more perfect portrait. I wish I could afford to buy one like it." "My dear fellow, I shall be delighted to give you a copy. It would be but a poor return for your kindness in getting me the commission. But with regard to Moreland, do you think he has any objection to me prolonging my stay in his house?" "I can assure you he has not. In the last letter I received from him, he said how glad he was that I had somebody here staying with me, as, after what has occurred, he did not like to think of me being left alone, with nobody but Madame Gaston in the house. You need not worry yourself upon that score. If he wished you to leave, Moreland is not the man to hesitate in telling you so. Besides, you are doing work for him." "I am glad to hear you say that, as the matter has been rather upon my mind lately. It is awfully decent of him, and he is giving me the run of my teeth here, and a jolly good run it is, too, as well as the pleasure of your society." "I wish it had been under more pleasant circumstances," Clayton said. "I wonder if he will still wish me to continue in the post of his secretary. I am afraid not." "Why?" "It is hardly likely he will make his home here again after what has happened. Besides, the inheritance of such a large fortune as that which Miles Rossiter left to him will probably alter his plans for the future." "Very true. But the acquisition of so much wealth will be an additional reason for him to want to retain your services. He will require a secretary far more now than he has done in the past. The question in my mind is whether or not your services will be available." "What do you mean? I do not understand you." McLean shook his head knowingly and winked across the table towards his friend. "There is a certain young lady, and very charming lady, who is at present living not 100 miles from here, and she might have a word to say to that. My dear Lawrence, if you marry Miss Rossiter, as I certainly hope you will for both your sakes, although you will not be rich beyond the dreams of avarice, it will certainly no longer be necessary for you to act as secretary to any man, however wealthy he may be. You will have other duties, and far more pleasant ones, to attend to." Clayton flushed slightly. "It is the greatest wish of my life to call that girl my wife," he said. "I do not care whether she comes to me as an heiress or as a pauper. I love her for what she is, and not for what she has got." "Quite so," McLean replied with true Scottish shrewdness. "But it is much better that the lady of your choice should have something than nothing. I do not hold with the idea that men only marry rich girls for what they can get out of them. A nice girl is just as lovable, whether she is rich or poor. Of course, some men are always on the make in their matrimonial affairs, but, for the matter of that, so are some of the women, and I am not sure that the latter are not more conspicuous in that respect than the former. Well, anyhow, if I am lucky enough to marry Verna, and I know she cares for me, I shall not live an idle life at the expense of my wife's fortune," Clayton said. "The man who does that is a cad, and not worthy the love of a good woman." "I am inclined to agree with you. But that particular class of cad is very much to the front in the matrimonial market," McLean muttered, "and irrespective of sex or of class." The discussion continued for some time longer, for Clayton welcomed any subject with his friend which bore upon his affection for Verna Rossiter. The very sound of her name was a delight to him, and he knew Athol McLean well enough to speak his mind freely. Their conversation was, however, interrupted by the sound of subdued voices upon the landing above them, and the soft tread of footsteps descending the stairs. The clock upon the mantelpiece struck the hour of 11. "Here they come," McLean whispered, as the two figures appeared in the misty distance overhead. "I wonder if they have come to any reasonable solution of the mystery. 2 heads are supposed to be better than 1, but everything depends upon what those 2 heads contain." "It will be best not to ask them any questions," Clayton said. "If there is anything to know, they will tell us in their own good time." "Right you are, but they have been a devil of a time in those rooms." Dr. Ferguson was the first to come into the hall. He carried a lighted candle in his hand, which he placed upon the table without extinguishing the flame. Clayton noticed that his face was very grave, and the lines had deepened about his forehead and mouth. Greatorex looked as inscrutable as ever. The keenest observer could have gained no inkling of his thoughts by the expression upon his features or the mild light in his blue eyes. They advanced to the center of the great chamber and then paused. "I think, gentlemen, we have done all that is necessary tonight," Greatorex said, turning from Clayton to McLean as he spoke. "I am glad to tell you that the time I have spent here upon former occasions has not been wasted. The theories I had previously formed have been considerably strengthened, and, I believe, confirmed by the valuable assistance I have received tonight from my friend Dr. Ferguson." "I am glad to hear you say so," Clayton exclaimed. "Then it looks as if there is some chance of proving the truth of the statements made by Mr. McLean and myself at the inquest?" The words are spoken, not as a question, but as a mere statement of fact. "Yes," Greatorex said shortly. Then he sat down beside the table and took a small diary from his waistcoat pocket. After turning over the leaves hurriedly, he paused and looked at Clayton. "This is Wednesday night," he said, glancing again at the little book in his hand. "I shall have to go up to London tomorrow. Will you give me a permit to look over your chambers in town?" "Certainly," Clayton replied, and he took one of his private cards from his case and scribbled the necessary order in pencil upon the back of it. "Thank you," Greatorex said, as he slipped it into his pocketbook. "There is only one other matter I need trouble you about now. Is Christopher Moreland in London?" "Yes, as far as I know. I heard from him this morning, and his letter was addressed from his rooms in Acton Chambers." "Then will you wire him tomorrow morning and ask him to run down here for the night? There are one or two points in connection with this affair which I should like to place before him, as he is the owner of this place, and the late man, Miles Rossiter, was his guest at the time of the murder. I think he ought to know them before anyone else." "I will send him a telegram the first thing in the morning," Clayton said. "At what time would you like to meet him?" Greatorex had torn a leaf out of his pocketbook and was busy writing upon it. As soon as he had finished, he handed the slip of paper to Clayton. "This is the wording of the telegram I want you to send. I fear he is in a very poor state of health just now, so it would be best not to trouble him more than necessary. You agree with me, Doctor?" "Entirely," Ferguson replied, with a slow inclination of his head. "It would be most undesirable to give him any particulars as to why his presence is wanted here." Clayton glanced at the paper in his hand and read the following message. "Can you dine here this evening and stay the night? Urgent. Wire reply." "But why should you not send it off from Ardley in my name?" he asked. "That would save time. I do not know what his engagements are, but this ought to reach him as soon as possible." "You are right," Greatorex replied, as he took back the paper and put it in his pocket. "I will dispatch it before breakfast tomorrow morning, and when you get the reply you must let me know what his answer is. I hope to be back at the doctor's house during the afternoon, but I may be detained in town." When they had left the nunnery, McLean turned to his friend with a sly look in his eye. "I would bet my bottom dollar they have got something up their sleeves, but new cords would not draw it from them until they have seen Moreland and put their case before him." "I think you are right," Clayton said, as he lit a cigarette. "Undoubtedly, Moreland is the first person who should hear anything they may have discovered. I wonder what it is." Long into the small hours of the morning, two men sat side by side at the table in a dimly lighted room at Ardley, carefully comparing notes which covered many sheets of paper. Very few words passed between them, but occasionally a whispered exclamation rose from the lips of one of them as he underlined certain words with a red pencil. "I think our evidence is conclusive, Doctor." "Yes, I think so." "Can you detect any flaw in it?" "Not one." Greatorex rose from his chair and stretched himself with a slow yawn. "The next act in the drama will begin when I return from London tomorrow afternoon," he said grimly. "Yes." "And the final curtain will fall tomorrow night." "I believe so." Dr. Ferguson looked sternly up at the man who faced him. "It will be a ghastly sequel to a terrible crime." "Yes, but you are a remarkable man, Doctor, to have discovered the central idea of the whole plot." "It would have been valueless without your help," Ferguson said. "I only evolved a theory. You reduced that theory to what is possible and crystallized it into a fact." End of chapter 25. The Hidden Mask by Guise Mitford. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. Clayton and McLean were finishing breakfast upon the following morning when the door opened, and the small maid entered the dining room bringing a telegram upon a tray. She handed it to Clayton. "Is there any answer?" he asked as he tore open the envelope. "I do not know, sir," she replied nervously, "but the boy is still waiting outside." Clayton read the message hurriedly, and then tossed the paper over to his companion. It was brief, but to the point. "Will reach you 9 o'clock tonight. Impossible sooner. Moreland." While McLean was reading it, Clayton fetched a sheet of paper from the writing table and quickly wrote the following words, which he addressed to Greatorex, care of Dr. Ferguson, Ardley. "Will be here 9 o'clock tonight. Clayton." "Give that to the boy and tell him to take it to Dr. Ferguson's as soon as he gets back to Ardley. Here are some coppers for his trouble." "Thank you, sir." The girl left the room, and the two men were left alone again. There was a long silence between them, which was broken by McLean. "I hope we shall be present when Greatorex unfolds his theories and conclusions," he said. "I think we have some claim to be among the first to hear his news, if he has any. What do you think?" "I quite agree with you, for there is no doubt he has some very important information indeed," Clayton answered, as he tore up the telegram and threw the pieces into the fire. "He would not have asked me to send that wire if Moreland's presence had not been necessary here. But what are you going to do today? It will be a long time before 9 o'clock comes, and the more we speculate upon what may happen tonight, the slower the hours will pass. Will you motor me over to Tunbridge Wells again? There is nothing I should like better. We cannot stop indoors and mope about the house all day." McLean walked to the window as he spoke and looked out. "I should not be surprised if we had more snow. The clouds are heavy and the glass is falling." "Then we will go and lunch with Lady Anna and Verna. They are starting for London this afternoon, and I promise to look them up again before they leave Tunbridge Wells. Besides, they will be anxious to hear our news." "I will drive you in with pleasure," McLean said, "but I think I had better lunch elsewhere. They will not want me there, and you know that 2 are company, 3 are not." "My dear Athol, that is all nonsense. You are a great favourite with both the ladies, and Lady Anna has told me more than once that she hoped I would bring you with me the next time I called." He laughed, and then added, "Besides, if 3 are not company, 4 are." "Ah, now I see what you are after," McLean said, joining in the laugh. "You want to palm her ladyship off on me and have Miss Rossiter to yourself. That is your game, is it? Well, I hope you will do the same for me one of these days." "Indeed I will. It only rests with you to give me the opportunity." Lady Anna and Verna took their meals in a private sitting-room, and they gave a cordial welcome to their guests. The girl was still very much broken in health and spirits, and Clayton was surprised to notice an expression upon her face which he had rarely seen there before, and that was only during the few occasions when they had discussed the existence of the dwarf Harris together. He took an early opportunity of mentioning the fact to Lady Anna as they stood alone beside the window, waiting for lunch to be served. "It will be a good thing for Miss Rossiter when she gets away from this place, and everything that can remind her of what has happened," he said. "Do you not think she is looking very ill, as though she were brooding too much over the past? She does not seem as well this morning as when I saw her last." Lady Anna shook her head in a very determined manner, and an expression of annoyance came to her face. "I can easily explain the reason for that," she replied in a low voice. "Verna had a visitor this morning, and I fear their conversation has rather upset her. I did my best to persuade her not to see him, but it was no good. This is the result of it." "A visitor!" Clayton exclaimed in surprise. At once the thought occurred to him that Christopher Morland had been to the hotel in order to further his suit. He bit his lip in silence for a few moments and glanced at the girl who was talking to McLean at the other end of the room. "May I ask who the visitor was?" "He was a man called Greatorex, and I understand he is a detective who is interesting himself, with your consent, in the mystery of her father's death." "Do you know the subject of their conversation?" "I was not present at the interview," Lady Anna replied, "but Verna tells me he called to obtain any information she could give him with regard to her parents' acquaintance with Christopher. Of course she could tell him very little, as their connection was only a business one." Clayton gave a sigh of relief. "Is that all?" he asked. "All?" Lady Anna repeated, as a waiter entered the room bringing the first installment of lunch. "I think it is quite enough. I have been doing my best to distract her thoughts from the tragedy ever since we came here, and now this man turns up and keeps her for nearly an hour talking about it. It is really most vexatious." It was still early in the afternoon when Lady Anna's maid came to inform her mistress that the hotel omnibus would be at the door in 10 minutes' time, and her ladyship hurried off to see that all the preparations for their departure were complete. Verna's traveling things were lying ready on the sofa, and she began to put on her hat in front of the glass above the mantelpiece. It was exactly at that moment McLean suddenly remembered that he had a most important letter to write, and he hastened from the room with most suspicious haste. "Verna, you have seen Greatorex this morning?" Clayton said, as soon as they were alone together. She started violently and turned towards him. The troubled look upon her face had become accentuated, and her hands trembled as she tied the knot of her veil. "Yes, I saw him this morning." "Will you let me know what he said, and what you told him?" "No, I cannot do that. I promised him our conversation should be kept private," she answered uneasily, "but only on the condition that he tells you everything himself. He assured me he would do so upon the earliest opportunity." "Did he mention the dwarf?" "Hush!" she gasped, and her pale face became suddenly distorted with terror. "Do not ask me any questions. You will hear everything there is to know from Mr. Greatorex. I cannot talk about it to you. It is horrible." Clayton walked to the window and stared moodily out across the common that stretched in front of him. When he returned to the girl's side, the worried expression had left his face. "When shall I see you again?" he asked. "I do not know," she replied wistfully. "We start for Italy at the end of the month, and it is not settled how soon we shall be back in England." "But, dear, I must see you again before you go. There are any amount of things I want to talk over with you." "Can you not come up to London before we leave?" Clayton hesitated. "That all depends upon what happens during the next few days," he replied. "My place is at the nunnery, at any rate for the present, but I will ask Morland when I see him this evening. There is no reason why I should not put in a week in London, and I hate the idea of you going away for any length of time without seeing you again, if only to say good-bye and to wish you Godspeed." Then the door opened, and Lady Anna bustled in, followed by her maid. Behind them stood the massive form of Athol McLean, who had evidently finished his letter in record time. He had already arranged to motor the two ladies down to the station, leaving the maid to take the luggage in the hotel omnibus. On their return to the nunnery, Clayton found that a letter had arrived for him by the afternoon post. He so rarely received letters of any kind, except from Morland, that he looked at it with some curiosity before he opened it. The name and address were in a handwriting which he did not know. McLean was glancing through the evening paper when he heard a startled exclamation from his friend, who was standing beside the lighted lamp, reading the communication in his hand. "Not another mystery, I hope," Athol said. I do not ask for your confidence, but, my dear fellow, do tell me if it is good news or bad." Clayton handed him the letter, and he looked at once at the signature. It was from Lord Orsett, and was worded as follows: "Dear Clayton, I do not know what your arrangements are with regard to my cousin, Christopher Morland, but I should think it is rather a poor sort of job. My secretary has recently resigned his post with me, owing to family matters which concern neither of us. I am therefore writing to ask if you would care to take his place. If so, please let me know your decision during the next few days, as my sister is taking Miss Rossiter and myself off to some God-forsaken place abroad shortly, and I should want you to come with me. I hope you will see your way to accept my offer, and we can arrange details later on." What a ghastly affair this was at the nunnery! I am sure you would be glad to get away from the place and its associations. The ladies join me here in town this afternoon, and we remain at the above address till the end of the month. Yours sincerely, Orsett. McLean handed it back to Clayton. "By Jove, you are in luck," he said. "Of course you will accept." "Rather. It seems too good to be true. I do not think Morland will raise any objection, for, after all, they are cousins, and he can find plenty of men to do my work here better than I can. I suppose Lady Anna did not know anything about this when we saw her today, or she would have mentioned it." "I expect she knew a good deal more than you think," McLean said, "and you probably have to thank her for the offer as much as his lordship. Lady Anna is no fool, and she sees pretty clearly what the position is between Miss Rossiter and yourself." They sat talking over the new situation which had arisen till the dressing bell sounded somewhere at the back of the building, and then hurried upstairs to their rooms. The old hereditary love for social forms and etiquette was a strong characteristic of Morland's, and it was always understood that they were obeyed, even when he and Clayton were alone together. The clock upon Clayton's table was striking the hour, and he had just finished his preparations when he heard the sound of a motor coming along the drive and stop outside the front door. Christopher Morland was a punctual man in all his engagements, and was never too late or too early unless there was some definite reason for being so. But more than half an hour passed before he joined his two guests in the hall downstairs. He looked pale and worried, and Clayton noticed a restless expression in his eyes which he had not seen there before. His health had not improved during his sojourn in London, and he moved slowly with the help of his two sticks. "I am sorry to have kept you waiting," he said, as he shook hands with the two men who came forward to meet him. "My servant seems to have missed the train at Victoria, and I had to come down alone." He smiled in a strained way as he spoke. "That may appear a small matter to you, but it means a great deal to me. I have been obliged to do my own unpacking, and, in my present state of health, the exertion is a painful and a tedious one." "I wish you would have let me know," Clayton said. "Of course, I should have come at once and done it for you." "Thank you. I am sure you would. I did not think of it, or I should have taken advantage of your help. Now then, shall we go in to dinner?" Never before had the great dining-room appeared to Clayton so spacious and so gloomy. The tall silver candlesticks upon the table threw a bright light upon the spotless cloth, and the silver, and the glass, but beyond that the darkness was impenetrable. Even the fire that smoldered in the wide grate seemed to be trying to pierce the mist like an evil bloodshot eye, watching the men as they silently took their seats. An uncanny shiver passed down Clayton's spine as he drew his chair beneath him. He remembered that the same sensation had affected him before, and it had always been associated with the coming of the dwarf. A sudden, indescribable feeling of fear took possession of him, and he glanced furtively round the room. He could see nothing except the table at which he sat and his two companions, but he instinctively knew that the evil presence of Harris was not far from him, that his baneful influence was making itself felt in some psychic manner which he could not understand. A quick look at McLean, who sat in front of him, did much to restore his self-composure. The artist was in no way troubled with any such sensation, and was enjoying his dinner with all the appreciation of a healthy appetite. Of course, the absence of the faithful Emile accounted for a good deal. There were no lights upon the sideboard. The standard lamps in the distant corners were unlit. There were only Madame Gaston and her niece to attend to them, which was a strange contrast to the silent, deaf footmen who had flitted ghost-like behind their chairs upon former occasions. Although Morland rarely touched wine or spirits himself, he was a generous host to his guests, and he had ordered more than one bottle of champagne to be opened. Clayton sipped the amber liquid in his glass with a relish it had never given him before. It warmed his blood and cleared his brain, and it set the nerves tingling all through his body. The uncanny feeling grew faint within him and finally passed off. As soon as the soup had been taken away, and a couple of pheasants placed before Morland, which he carved with great difficulty, refusing Clayton's offer of help, their host asked the question which had been expected by both his guests since the moment when they had met him in the hall after his arrival. He turned to his secretary with a look of inquiry. "Your telegram was worded urgent, or I should have not undertaken the journey down here tonight. Is it a private matter with which you want to see me about?" His gaze was directed at McLean as he asked the question, but the artist was so busy enjoying his dinner that he did not see the look. "It is not a matter which need to be kept private from our friend here," Clayton said, as he dropped his voice to a whisper. "It is in connection with the murder of Miles Rossiter." Christopher Morland shifted his position in his chair and slowly sipped the tumbler of soda water beside him. "Has any clue been discovered that will explain the crime?" he asked anxiously. "If so, I should like to know it at once." "That is exactly what I cannot tell you." "What do you mean?" "The message I sent you was not from myself. It was from another man." Morland raised his eyebrows slightly and fingered a silver fork beside his plate. "Another man? Who is he?" "He is the doctor who attended the inquest," Clayton replied. "He was the one who came with the police as soon as the murder was discovered." "I do not remember his name." "His name is Ferguson, Dr. Ferguson of Ardley." "But why did he send such a message to me and through a third person? My address in London is not a secret one." "He wishes to submit to you certain evidence which has been obtained with regard to the crime by his friend, Mr. Greatorex." "And who is Greatorex?" "He is an ex-detective who was formerly employed at Scotland Yard." "What has he found out?" "That I do not yet know." "Where has he been making his inquiries?" "In this house." "In this house? But what right had this man, Greatorex, or Ferguson for that matter, to carry on investigations here without my leave?" "The evidence given at the inquest was so unsatisfactory that Dr. Ferguson thought it would be a good thing to get a capable detective to try and sift the facts and form an impartial opinion. Everybody connected with the crime, including yourself, would naturally be anxious for the truth to be known if possible. After the verdict, there was no alternative way of doing this except by private inquiry." "In my house, and without my permission? Why was I not told of this?" "Because the doctor thought it would give you less worry and anxiety if these investigations were carried on privately. As soon as anything definite was known, you were, of course, to be the first to hear of it. It is for that reason that I sent you the telegram." "Then something definite has been discovered?" "I conclude so because I was asked to wire you, asking for your attendance here tonight." "Is he coming to see me? Here? Tonight?" For the first time since Clayton had met Moreland, he saw an ugly glint of anger flash through his eyes. It lasted only a moment, but it left an uncomfortable impression upon Clayton's mind. "I expect him here every moment." "And the man Greatorex?" "He will probably accompany the doctor," Clayton replied. "It is to his work and efforts that you owe whatever information he is going to put before you." "As I did not authorize any such inquiries to be made here, I consider the behavior of these men a most presumptuous and uncalled for piece of impertinence, and I refuse to see them." Moreland leaned across the table as he spoke. "I also think you have considerably abused the confidence I placed in you, Mr. Clayton, by allowing such a thing to take place." Clayton flushed at the words. "I assure you that your welfare was our first consideration." "I do not want to be assured of anything of the kind," Moreland replied coldly. "I shall be obliged if you will consider your engagement with me terminates tomorrow morning. The car will be at the door to take you and your friend to the station in time to catch the midday train to London." But Clayton did not finish the sentence, for at that moment a man stepped forward out of the surrounding darkness and advanced to the table. Moreland did not see him, for he came from behind his chair. But both McLean and his friend started suddenly from their seats and stared wide-eyed at the stranger. Neither of them had seen him before. He advanced to Moreland's side and placed a hand upon his arm. "Christopher Moreland," he said, "in the king's name, I arrest you for the wilful murder, in this house, of the man Miles Rossiter." End of chapter 26. The Hidden Mask by Guise Mitford. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. Moreland turned hastily round in his chair and looked up at the man who stood over him. "What is the meaning of this?" he said furiously. "Who are you, and what the devil are you doing here at this time of night?" The stranger glanced behind him and gave a beckoning sign. As he did so, two men came forward from a distant dim corner and silently took up their positions, one upon each side of Moreland's chair. "The reason for my visit is twofold," the stranger said. "In the first place, I hold a warrant to arrest you on the charge of murdering Miles Rossiter in this house during the early hours of the first day of this month. In the second place, I have written authority from Scotland Yard to search every room in this building." Moreland had turned very pale as he listened to the words, but the anger still glinted in swift, bright flashes from his eyes. For a few moments he did not speak. Then he turned swiftly towards Clayton. "Is this any of your work?" he asked with a thinly veiled sneer. "If it is meant as a practical joke, it is singularly ill-timed and out of place." Clayton's eyes were fixed upon the men who had suddenly appeared out of the darkness and grouped themselves behind Moreland, and his throat became dry as he noticed the stern expressions upon their faces. "I swear I know nothing about this outrage," he replied huskily. "I have no more idea who these fellows are than you have, nor what is their business." "This is no practical joke," said the man who appeared to be in authority, as he drew a couple of official-looking papers from his pocket. "Here is my warrant for your arrest. Here also are my instructions to search this house. I do not know anything about these other two gentlemen. My business is with you, Mr. Moreland, and with you alone." "This is a most infernal piece of insolence, which I shall make you pay dearly for," Moreland said as he moved his chair a few inches backward and glared up at the person who addressed him. "What is your name?" "I am Superintendent Mills of Scotland Yard," the man replied. "Here is my card." He placed it upon the table as he spoke. "I must warn you that anything you now say will or may be used in evidence against you later on." Moreland leaned back with a growl like an angry animal. "Damn you!" he said. "If you do not instantly leave this house, I will have you thrown out. You will do nothing of the sort," the superintendent said sternly. "I have got enough men with me here tonight to make your arrest an easy matter in spite of any resistance. It will be best if you will quietly consent to let me take possession of your house. You cannot escape, and I do not wish to make things more unpleasant for you than is necessary." Moreland started to rise from his chair, but the men standing on either side of him moved a step nearer to where he sat. "But you do not seem to realize that your behavior is an insult which I do not intend to submit to quietly. I no more murdered Miles Rossiter than you did. Why, he was a personal friend of mine and a guest in my house." He lifted his eyes as he spoke. "My God, you will suffer for this." In the meantime, Clayton had to some extent recovered his self-control. He advanced quickly to the superintendent's side and faced him. "You have made a terrible mistake," he said. "Mr. Moreland is as innocent of that crime as I am. I saw the assassin enter the room where the murder was committed, and I heard the shot fired. So also did that gentleman who was with me at the time." He pointed to McLean. "That is quite right," the artist said, and he looked very much as if he was going to make for the superintendent and throw him out of the room. "We both saw the murderer, and we are prepared to swear in any court of law that he was not Mr. Moreland. I tell you, you are making a damned fool of yourself, and the sooner you get out of the house, the better. You are upon the wrong track altogether this time. The man you want is an infernal little dwarf who goes by the name Harris. When you have caught him, you will have got the right man, and I will be among the first to give evidence against him." Moreland was sitting thoughtfully, tapping his fingers upon the table. A deep red spot had come to each of his cheeks, and he was staring straight in front of him. The superintendent placed a hand upon his shoulder. "Now, Mr. Moreland," he said, "if you have finished your dinner, I must ask you to come into another room where I can speak to you privately." "Do you really mean this?" "I do, and under the circumstances I must instruct my men to search you." Moreland started. "Searched? What for?" "I've got my orders," the superintendent replied, "and my business is to obey them. You must be searched in case you carry firearms upon your person. Please stand up." "And if I refuse?" The officer lifted his shoulders with a deprecating gesture. "The inference would be obvious," he answered, "and the consequences most unpleasant for yourself." Christopher Moreland rose painfully to his feet, and there was an ugly look upon his face as he did so. "Unfortunately, I am not in a position to refuse," he said, "but the time will come when you will be sorry for this behavior." "Shall we chuck these blighters out?" McLean shouted furiously. "I think Lawrence and I can tackle them between us." "I do not know who you are, sir," the superintendent said, "but it would be best for you not to mix yourself up in this matter. Any force you may attempt to use would be worthless, as I have ample assistance here to carry out my instructions in spite of any opposition you may offer." While he was speaking, the two constables had been passing their hands in and out of Moreland's pockets and feeling the length of his body to discover any hidden weapon that might be concealed there. As soon as they had finished their examination, they looked towards their chief and shook their heads. "Right," the superintendent said, addressing Moreland. "If you will show the way, sir, we will now retire to another room." It was evident there were other unseen occupants of the apartment besides those who were visible, for as Moreland advanced towards the door, it opened slowly, and the strange procession passed out into the dim light of the hall. Clayton counted 5 figures, besides those of his host and Superintendent Mills. As the door closed behind them, he turned to McLean with a low whistle. "They will have the devil to pay for this," he said. "What do you think is their game?" McLean poured himself another glass of port and sipped it in silence for a few moments. Then he resumed his seat. "I think both Ferguson and Greatorex have made a terrible blunder," he replied. "I cannot understand what they are up to. They know as well as you and I do that Moreland did not kill Miles Rossiter." "Of course they do. Besides, we both saw who it was who did commit the crime. There is no doubt about that. It was the dwarf Harris. Yes, it was the dwarf. Although we did not actually see the murder performed, we know there was only one person who could have done it, and that person was undoubtedly Harris. Why, we saw him enter the room, and we heard the shot fired. Nobody entered or left that room afterwards except ourselves. There is a ghastly mistake somewhere, and I fear our little friend Greatorex is at the bottom of it. He has worked very hard, but he has come to the wrong conclusion this time." Clayton was walking slowly up and down the room, deep in thought. Both the men heard the sounds of distant voices and the tread of feet upstairs and in the hall. McLean had lit his pipe and was staring at the darkness above him. They did not speak much. Each of them was conscious of some impending disaster and was waiting expectant, not knowing for what. Nearly an hour passed in this way, and McLean had almost emptied the well-filled decanter of port beside him, when the silence of the house was suddenly broken by a shrill, long-drawn cry which chilled the marrow in their bones. It was the sound of a man's voice, in hellish fury, but not in pain. As he heard it, the same uncanny feeling returned to Clayton, and he shivered, though the room was warm. He paused in his walk and looked towards his friend. "What does that mean?" "Don't ask me," McLean replied nervously. "I am beginning to think I do not know what anything means in this infernal house." Again the long shriek echoed through the silence. It sounded like the cry of some creature, half human, half animal. It was the voice of passion, lust, fury, despair. Both the men in the dining room hastened towards the door, as though moved by a common impulse. Clayton glanced backwards as he did so at the picture of the white-covered table, with its wealth of silver and glass and hothouse flowers and fruit. Beyond it the misty darkness, veined with blue clouds of cigarette smoke. Above it the great gloom of massive rafters, dimly seen in the hazy space. As they reached the door, it opened suddenly, and a figure appeared upon the threshold. The light was behind it, glimmering faint from the hall, and they could not see the face. As soon as he spoke, however, they recognized the voice of Dr. Ferguson. "Come," he said in a low, hushed voice. "You are wanted in the library." Clayton laid a hand upon his arm and drew him forward. "Ferguson," he gasped, "for God's sakes, tell us what all this means. The whole thing is absurd, a ridiculous mistake. Moreland is as innocent of that crime as I am." The doctor disengaged himself gently, but without a word, and led the way across the hall to the door of the library, which was open. On either side of it stood a man in dark relief against the deeper gloom of the oak paneling behind him. Clayton followed his leader like a man in a dream. He did not raise his eyes till he had entered the room. There was a horrible silence about him. Only his own steps made sound upon the bare boards he trod. A dull numbness had come to his brain, though his senses of touch and of sight had grown keenly alert. He felt the body of McLean pressing close behind him. He could feel the hot breath from his nostrils upon his neck. Then he looked up, slowly, fearfully, at the scene in front of him. Each detail of it left a lasting impression upon his memory which remains to this day. As he realized the gruesome significance of what he saw there, he gave a low moan of horror and staggered forward. Facing him upon the sofa was the distorted shape of a human figure, and the superintendent was holding a lamp over it. Behind him stood 3 tall men, and Greatorex was bending over the cushion upon which the head of the person rested. "Oh, my God!" Clayton panted. "This is terrible. I do not understand it. No, I cannot believe it." It was the superintendent's voice which broke the silence that followed his words. He placed the lamp upon a table behind him and looked straight at Clayton. "This is the man who murdered Miles Rossiter," he said. "You say you can deny it. Look at him now." Clayton's eyes were fixed with a growing horror upon the form coiled up in front of him. He reeled across the room and leaned over the upturned face. The shape he saw was that of the dwarf, Harris, but the features were the features of Christopher Moreland. He sank back upon a chair which was quickly moved towards him and hid his face in his hands. The sight of it and all it meant to him was more than he could bear. Then a soft musical voice broke the silence. It came from the figure upon the sofa, and the sound of it sent a thrill through every man in the room. "You devils," it said, as the ungainly mass of flesh moved uneasily where it lay. "You have got the truth out of me by force. Damn you! But you think I am in your power?" A weird laugh followed the words. "I am not. You think I shall swing for the murder I have committed? But you are mistaken. You have proved my guilt, but I have saved my neck, for I am now... The figure squirmed upon the sofa, and the great hands went convulsively to his throat. "I am going to show you how... Then a ghastly scene followed. The body began to wriggle and shake itself, while low moans went up from the distorted lips. The bulk of the dwarf shape appeared to be gradually contracting, while the victim was suffering excruciating agony. The men who stood around remained motionless. Each one of them knew that he could do nothing. Even Dr. Ferguson turned aside, averting his eyes from the hideous sight. "Kill me! For mercy's sake, kill me!" the dwarf shrieked as he moved among the cushions. "I emptied the tabloids into my mouth and swallowed them. Oh, God! Kill me! Kill me!" The figure rose and fell in shocking convulsions. Then it rolled to the ground, wreathing with a dreadful gurgling at the throat. For a moment the contracted muscles twitched. Then it lay still, a deformed, lifeless mass upon the carpet. Dr. Ferguson was already stooping over the body, feeling both the pulse and the heart. "It is a terrible end," he said as he straightened himself and glanced round him. "But God is more merciful to him than man would have been had he gone before a human judge and jury." "Is he dead?" Greatorex asked in a low voice. "Yes, he is dead." McLean stepped quickly to the chair where Clayton sat. He appeared to be in a dazed condition and hardly conscious. "Come, old pal," he said, as he helped him to rise from his seat. "There is nothing more we can do here, and I am going to take you to your room. We shall hear all we want to know tomorrow." Athol McLean is still haunted by the scene he then left behind him. Dark figures standing in the half-light, and upon the ground the lifeless body of the dwarf, Christopher Moreland. End of chapter 27. The Hidden Mask by Guise Mitford. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. 5 men sat round the table in the dining room of the nunnery, and in front of them were spread many papers. The expressions upon their faces were grave and serious. They were Superintendent Mills, Greatorex, and Dr. Ferguson. The other two men, Clayton and McLean, sat with anxious looks of inquiry upon their features, and both of them appeared nervous and ill at ease. The ex-detective sat at the head of the table, and upon either side of him sat the superintendent and the doctor. Clayton and McLean were opposite to each other. It was late in the morning of the day following the events recorded in the last chapter. Greatorex, whose hands had been busy among the papers and notebooks beside him, gave a low sigh of satisfaction as he drew from among them a small packet of manuscript and loosened the pink tape which held the sheets together. Then he glanced thoughtfully upwards, and the direction of his gaze alternated between the faces of the two men furthest from him. "I have asked you to meet me here, gentlemen, in order that I may place before you, as soon as possible, the facts which culminated in the terrible event we witnessed in this house last night," he said, in a slow, even voice. "The evidence which I am now going to submit to you will, of course, be repeated at the inquest of the unfortunate man who has taken his own life. I feel, however, it is my duty to let you know without delay the result of my investigations and inquiries, here and elsewhere, which directly led up to that tragedy, which is really a sequel to the former crime, the murder of Miles Rossiter." He paused and slightly altered the position of some of the papers in front of him. He was still directing his remarks exclusively to Clayton and to Athol McLean. The doctor and Superintendent Mills were leaning back in their chairs, and their countenances in no way betrayed the fact that they knew what was going to be said. "It is a long story, and a strange story," Greatorex continued. "I believe it to be one of the most remarkable episodes in all the annals of crime. Had it not been for the valuable assistance I have received from my friend Dr. Ferguson, I doubt whether the identity of Miles Rossiter's murderer would have ever been established. Now, gentlemen, I have before me 3 important documents dealing with this case, each of which is dependent upon the others in forging the links of evidence to prove indisputably that the man who murdered Miles Rossiter was Christopher Moreland." Clayton leaned hurriedly across the table. No, he said quickly. "That is impossible. The assassin was the dwarf, Harris." Greatorex raised a reproving hand for silence, and his forehead contracted into a slight frown. "I must ask you not to interrupt me, except to answer my questions," he said. "I have a very difficult and strange problem to unravel, and it is necessary that you should listen attentively to what I tell you, following each step I take in explaining this remarkable story with most careful reasoning. Now, the most important of these 3 documents is the diary of recent events which occurred both in London and here." He looked at Clayton as he spoke. "The 2 other statements deal with my own investigations of the case, and a medical theory or opinion upon the matter, written by Dr. Ferguson. These 3 documents, taken conjointly and in the light of what has subsequently happened, proved conclusively the all-important fact that Christopher Moreland and the dwarf Harris were one and the same person." He paused and pointed a finger towards Clayton, who was watching him intently and eagerly listening to every word. "You had ocular demonstration of the fact last night." "There is no possible doubt about it," the superintendent said quietly. "The body upstairs is surely evidence enough." "Before I begin the history of this weird dual personality, there are 3 facts which I wish to recall to your memory, Mr. Clayton," Greatorex said. "They have an important bearing upon all the other details of this mystery. In the first place, you never saw the dwarf in daylight. It was always at night when you met him, both in London and here. Am I correct?" "Yes," Clayton replied. "You are quite right." Secondly, the flats, respectively occupied by Moreland and Harris, were facing each other upon the same landing, and therefore within easy access of each other. Yes, that is so. Thirdly, the condition of Christopher Moreland's health was apparently bad, and he was often so infirm that he was obliged to use sticks to assist him in his movements. He was also always physically weaker than usual after those occasions when you had seen him and met the dwarf Harris. Clayton remained silent for some moments, then he nodded his head. Moreland always struck me as a man in delicate health, but yes, now you mention it, I do remember that his condition appeared much worse when I saw him after meeting the dwarf. Greatorex drew himself up in his chair and lightly tapped an open letter upon the table with a pencil in his hand. I confess, he said, that after I had concluded my investigations here, there were several points which baffled me, even after consulting the doctor. He held up the letter in his hand and replaced it in front of him. I have, however, this morning received a communication which fully explains all the matters which were the only missing links in my chain of evidence. Mr. Clayton, will you allow me to ring the bell for your servant, Madame Gaston?" Clayton nodded, and McLean, who was nearest to the fireplace, at once went and pulled the cord upon the wall. There was silence for a few moments, then the door opened, and the housekeeper's niece entered the room. "Where is Madame Gaston?" Greatorex asked sternly. The girl looked nervously from her questioner to Clayton, and fingered the corner of her apron. "Ask her to come here," Clayton said. "Mr. Greatorex wishes to see her." The girl hesitated. "Madame Gaston left the house early this morning," she said, with an anxious look at the men who were seated round the table. "Left?" Clayton exclaimed. "Where has she gone, and why did she leave?" Greatorex tapped his pencil upon the table and glanced significantly at the superintendent. "Let me know when she returns," he said. "Is there any other servant in the house besides yourself?" "No, sir." "Thank you. Then you may go." They waited till the door closed behind the girl and the sound of her retreating footsteps had died away in the distance. Then Greatorex broke the tense silence, addressing himself to Clayton. "Your worthy housekeeper will not return," he said, "at any rate to the nunnery. She is now on her way to join her husband in Amsterdam, though I much doubt if she will leave this country. Had I received this letter earlier in the day, I might have been able to intercept her departure, but Superintendent Mills has already sent a telegram to Scotland Yard, and by midday the police at every port in the country will be on the alert to arrest both Emile Gaston and his wife. I did not question that girl just now. If she is ignorant of the woman's movements, I should only have excited her suspicions. If she is aware of her aunt's present actions, which I doubt, she would have lied to me. Any chance of her escape from this house would now be impossible, for the police are already in possession of the place." Then Greatorex rose from his seat, with a rapid glance at the papers strewn before him. He seemed to be more at ease as he stood there than he had been in the deep oak chair in which he sat. He cleared his voice and again took up the letter to which he had already referred. "This communication, gentlemen, is from the man Emile Gaston," he said, "and I propose to deal with it first, as it explains the original motives and reasons that brought about those tragedies in which we are interested. It must be fully understood before we come to more recent events. I must again ask you to follow me very carefully, judging the information I am now going to place before you in connection with what has happened recently." Superintendent Mills had moved his chair a few inches nearer the speaker, and sat forward with his head resting upon his hands and his elbows upon the table. Dr. Ferguson leaned back in his seat, and his hands were clasped tight in front of him. His face was like a mask, but he was watching Greatorex with eager, professional look. Both Clayton and McLean were straining across the table, with every nerve tight strung, every sense at high pressure, and their gaze was fixed intently upon the mild blue eyes of the great detective. Some years ago, when the diamond mines were first being discovered in South Africa, 3 men were traveling in a then unknown district of that country, Greatorex began slowly. They had met each other by chance and continued their journey together, more for the sake of companionship than because they had any interest in common. They all belonged to the class which, in those days, was too often represented in our British dominions beyond the sea. They had left this country for various reasons, none of which were creditable to our notions of honesty and morality. Their names were Christopher Moreland, Miles Rossiter, and William Thorndyke. The first named of these men was, as you know, of good family, being, as a matter of fact, a near relative of the Earl of Orsett. Rossiter was a mere adventurer, with small means and unscrupulous conscience. I have not been able to trace his parentage, but he appears to have had a fairly good education and went out to South Africa to pick up any job which would put money in his pocket. His wife was dead, and he had only one child, whom he left behind him in England. That child was Miss Verna Rossiter. Clayton's lips twitched as the name was spoken, and the lines upon his face became more set as he listened to the story which was being unravelled before him. The third man was what I suppose in those days was called a squatter. He had a certain amount of land and money, and went in for farming upon a small scale. He was a man of weak character, and with 2 all-compelling vices, drink and gambling. Fortunately for him, he was rarely in a position to indulge either of them, but when the opportunity did present itself, he was willing to barter away his soul for a bottle of brandy, a toss with the dice, or a hand with cards. So you will readily understand that these 3 haphazard companions were about as unprincipled a trio as could be met within a long day's journey. Well, to cut a long story short, they found themselves one night in a small wayside hotel, far off the beaten track, and by that time both Moreland and Rossiter, though probably distrusting each other, knew that they had found a lamb to fleece between them. Cards and dice were produced, also a bottle of fiery South African spirits, and the devil himself must have been one of the party, for before they rose from the table, Thorndyke was mad drunk, and had gambled away everything he possessed. That hotel was run by a Frenchman and his wife, whose name was Gaston. Greatorex paused to moisten his lips with his tongue. Clayton went to the sideboard, and returned with a decanter and glasses which he placed upon the table. The 3 men continued their journey together, though Thorndyke was in a state of collapse bordering upon delirium tremens, and eventually reached the property which now belonged in equal shares to Christopher Moreland and Miles Rossiter. It was a poor place, with a dreary wooden hut in the center of what looked like useless pasture for sheep or cattle. Part of it was veldt, part of it was bordered by rocky mountains, and a narrow river trickled through the center, which, at times, was only a succession of pools. They remained there a month, but before the first 2 weeks were over, Rossiter had found out that the dreary hut was worth more than its weight in gold. He had discovered diamonds. Diamonds? It was Clayton who spoke the word with a quick indrawing of his breath. The word recalled to his memory his experience of finding the glittering necklace in the cab upon the night when he first met the dwarf, the exchange of the real stones for artificial ones, his subsequent interview with Miles Rossiter, the eager interest shown by Harris with regard to their disappearance, and his insistence that they had been stolen from the body of the murdered man, whom he found in his London chambers. What happened after that discovery can be easier imagined than described, Greatorex continued.
Undoubtedly, Miles Rossiter held the trump card which commanded the situation. He had already spent some years prospecting for ore and precious stones in many countries, and he alone knew the value of the property which had come into the possession of himself and Christopher Moreland. He therefore struck a bargain with his partner. In exchange for his professional knowledge, it was arranged that he should pocket 2/3 of the wealth derived from the diamonds found on the estate, while his partner should receive the remaining 1/3 of the profits. This arrangement was mutually convenient to both the men, for, while it made Moreland a man of considerable wealth, it raised Rossiter to the position of a millionaire. After working the mine for a year upon a minimum of capital and labor, it occurred to Rossiter that it would be a good thing to form a company, with himself as chairman, while Moreland retained a considerable number of shares. Negotiations were opened with more than one financial magnate, both in England and in South Africa, and eventually the company was upon the eve of establishment. It was then that the man Gaston reappeared upon the scene. He had heard of what had been discovered upon the Thorndyke estate, and he saw his chance. It was during the evening before the day when the terms of agreement between Rossiter, Moreland, and the capitalists of the new company were to be ratified and legally entered into. A dinner was being held in a hotel at Cape Town, at which all the interested parties were assembled, when a note was brought to Moreland. It was the demand for an immediate interview between himself and Emile Gaston, and a very important interview it proved to be. It appears that both Gaston and his wife, upon the night in question, when Thorndyke had gambled away his estate, had watched the players at their game. They had not only seen that the two sober men had deliberately set themselves to make their companion drunk, but they had observed Christopher Moreland slip something from a bottle into Thorndyke's tumbler, which had the effect of reducing him almost to a condition of torpor. So much so, that when he had to sign the paper that admitted his liability, he was unable to hold a pen, and his hand was guided by Christopher Moreland himself. On the following morning Thorndyke's condition was a serious one, and he had to be driven in a cart to the nearest doctor's house, where he remained for some time, suffering from a complaint which nobody could understand. Now, gentlemen, the result of Gaston's evidence, which is supported not only by his wife, but backed up by the written report of the doctor who attended Thorndyke on that occasion, is such that, in a court of law, any jury would convict Rossiter and Moreland of having obtained possession of a valuable estate by criminal and unlawful means. These facts are clearly set down, though in fuller detail, here in the sworn statement I received this morning from the man Gaston. Greatorex held up in his hand the letter he referred to, and then slowly sipped the tumbler of hot water beside him. There was a deep silence among the men round the table. Each face was turned with interest and expectancy towards the mild blue eyes of the speaker. It now became merely a question of blackmail upon the part of Gaston and his wife. The man offered terms to Moreland, which, under the circumstances, appeared to have been extremely moderate for a man in his position. They were that Moreland should take them into his service, and provide generously for them during their lives, in addition to the immediate payment of a substantial check. Their terms were accepted, and Moreland returned to the dinner party, having saved his fortune and that of Rossiter as well. Upon the following day the success of the new diamond mine was assured and the necessary capital subscribed. Moreland and Rossiter were rich men. Thorndyke was a pauper and lying in a hospital, not expected to live for more than a few hours after an attempt at suicide. The Gastons were sent over to England, where the man eventually became valet to Moreland, and his wife was put in charge of this house in which we are now sitting. Greatorex drew towards him a packet of papers, which he carefully smoothed out upon the table with a ruler. "That, gentlemen, is the first half of the story which deals with these tragedies. I now come to more recent events with which you are familiar." End of chapter 28.
The Hidden Mask by Guise Mitford. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29. When Greatorex continued his narrative, he dropped his voice almost to a whisper, though each word could be distinctly heard in the spacious room where he stood. He was fully conscious that he was now going to deal with the succession of mysteries which have been set down in the preceding pages, and he addressed his remarks exclusively to Clayton. "You must please carefully follow the points which I am going to put before you. If any of the facts I state are inaccurate, I hope you will correct me." He glanced at Clayton as he spoke, and his look was met with a sympathetic nod. "The work of unraveling this mystery will be easier understood if I deal with the dual personality of Christopher Moreland as though it belonged to two separate people. You must, however, always bear in mind that, when I refer to the Dwarf Harris, I am also referring to the man who is now lying dead upstairs. I do not propose to enter into every particular of what happened in London and at this house between you, Mr. Clayton, and the dwarf, as the facts are already known to all of us. I shall only explain certain circumstances which at present appear inexplicable, but which are necessary for the elucidation of these crimes. The most important portion of my remarks will deal with the discoveries made by Dr. Ferguson and myself since I took the matter in hand. I learned from this diary that it was upon the evening of the 14th of last November when the first meeting took place between you and the Dwarf Harris, outside Miles Rossiter's house in Berkeley Square." Clayton nodded. "During the morning of that day you had received a letter from Miss Rossiter asking you to call at a particular hour that night. This was obviously written at the dictation of her father. In fact, I understand the lady has admitted it. The reason for writing that letter was to ensure your absence from your chambers at a certain time. I have visited those chambers, and I have also interviewed the caretaker, Mrs. Barrett. The results of my investigations point to two conclusions. In the first place, the rooms were undoubtedly suitable for the perpetration of a crime like murder. They were upon the third floor of the building. The tenant of the second floor was absent, and the ground floor was vacant. In the second place, the caretaker, who is very deaf, could not hear any struggle that might take place, and no one else was likely to be present in the house at that time of night. Now, in my interview with Mrs. Barrett, she distinctly affirmed that Christopher Moreland had been up to your rooms on the day before the murder, for she recognized him upon a subsequent occasion when you were with him yourself. She mentioned that fact to you, I think?" "Yes," Clayton replied, as Greatorex paused for an answer to his question. "I did not believe her, for there was no reason why Moreland should visit my rooms." "Pardon me, there was a very important reason. He wished to obtain a wax impression of your keyhole, so as to have a key made which would admit Rossiter during your absence. While he thought you were with his daughter in Berkeley Square, Miles Rossiter took Thorndyke to your chambers, and there he murdered him." Clayton sprang forward with a cry. "No, no! I do not believe it. Why should he do such a thing? My God, this cannot be true." "I will explain what was the position of affairs at that time," Greatorex continued evenly and without undue haste. "The man William Thorndyke had suddenly turned up in London, when both Rossiter and Moreland were under the impression that he had died in the Cape Town hospital.
He claimed that his property had been obtained from him by illegal means and demanded compensation. It was necessary for the two men who had swindled him to come to terms. They did so, and the arrangement made was that Thorndyke should be given diamonds of a certain value in exchange for a written statement signed by him that his property had been honestly bought. It was to effect this exchange that Rossiter got the man to your rooms that night. He carried the diamond, and Thorndyke had his written statement. I do not believe that Rossiter actually intended to kill the man, but he safeguarded himself against any untoward event by not having the interview in his own house. It was safer that it should take place in the rooms of another person, and you were the person chosen. By some mistake, which I cannot explain with certainty, though several theories are plausible, the diamonds were left in the cab which Rossiter used that evening, and by a remarkable coincidence you occupied the same cab afterwards, and found the parcel there.
It was outside Gatti's restaurant in the Strand, Clayton said.
So I gather from your diary. I presume the two men went there to fill up their time before continuing their journey to the temple. On your return home, you found the murdered body of Thorndyke upon the floor, and almost immediately afterwards you were joined by the dwarf. My opinion is that he did not expect to find Thorndyke there, and it is uncertain what was his object in following you, unless it was to try and find out the result of your conversation with Miss Rossiter, or to again impress upon you the desirability of becoming Moreland's secretary, or, in other words, his own secretary.
Greatorex paused and wiped his spectacles.
He then made you an offer of a private nature, upon the condition that you accepted his friendship and carried out his instructions, did he not?
A flush came to Clayton's face as he inclined his head in agreement.
And you refused?
Most certainly.
Good. You then left your rooms and reported the matter to the police, having locked the dwarf in the apartment alone with the corpse. Upon your return, with Dr. Bransbury and a constable, you found your chambers empty, but the dwarf and the body had disappeared.
That was so.
You'll pardon me for saying so, Mr. Clayton, but in the entire absence of any proof of what you told the police, you will understand their very natural suspicion that the whole story was a fabrication, and that you were suffering from a delusion.
But how could the dwarf take the body downstairs and leave it in a room upon the ground floor?
In the first place, you must remember that the house was empty, save for Mrs. Barrett, who was deaf. Secondly, the dwarf must have had a duplicate key, similar to the one which he, as Moreland, obtained for Rossiter. Thirdly, you know from your own experience with him in the drive here on Christmas Eve that even in his disjointed state he was an abnormally strong man. I believe he used his teeth to help him draw the body downstairs.
Clayton shuddered. He recalled the ghastly circumstances so well.
But why did he make me that offer? He asked. Because he had no intention of fulfilling it, Greatorex replied dryly. Both Christopher Moreland and Rossiter were ambitious men, and equally unscrupulous. Each of them was playing his best trump card against the other at the time. Moreland wanted to marry the millionaire's only child. Rossiter would not consent to the union, except on the condition that the dwarf insured the death of Lord Orsett, in which case Moreland would succeed to the title and estates. In this matter, Rossiter was entirely in the hands of Moreland, who is heir presumptive to his cousin, and if Rossiter had looked elsewhere for a noble alliance for his daughter, Moreland would not have hesitated to disclose the whole of his plot, though taking care to shield himself.
Greatorex paused again to take another sip from the tumbler beside him. After a few moments he resumed his story, and the four men who listened to him marveled at the wonderful logic of his arguments as he proceeded to unfold and explain his version of the causes and effects of the problems that had baffled them all.
Dr. Ferguson was the only man among them who seemed entirely satisfied in his mind with the tangled skein of mystery which was being unwound before them. "Why did the dwarf want me to murder Lord Orsett?" Clayton asked, breaking the silence. "Because he intended to hand you over to the police afterwards, or murder you himself," Greatorex replied, as he placed his glass upon the table. "He would then have succeeded to the earldom, and hoped to win Miss Rossiter for his wife. Your services would have been no longer required. He was simply using you as a tool to further his own designs." "May I ask for a little information upon one point?" It was McLean who put the question, and Greatorex nodded his consent. "What I cannot understand is this, and I am sure my friend Mr. Clayton feels the same. The whole of the facts you are setting before us are based upon the assumption that Christopher Moreland and the dwarf Harris were one and the same man. Have you any proof that this was so, beyond the ghastly sight we saw in the library last night? I admit that Moreland was disjointed, but neither his face nor his voice in any way resembled those of the dwarf." "There is plenty of proof in support of every assertion I have made," Greatorex replied. "The alteration in the appearance of the face was simply a matter of clever make-up, which would not be detected in the dim lights or darkness in which he showed himself. Had anybody clutched at the hair upon his face, it would have come out in handfuls. Also the wig. The change in his voice was the natural effect, or result, of his altered physical condition, due to the respiratory organs which suffered in consequence. Dr. Ferguson was responsible for the idea of the identity between Moreland and the dwarf. As soon as that theory was proved possible, half of the mystery was explained, for the dual existence was established, as well as the motive for the crime. The certainty of that theory being correct was put beyond all doubt by no less a person than Miss Rossiter herself." "By Verna!" Clayton exclaimed. "Impossible!" "On that memorable night, the 14th of last November, when the young lady invited you to her father's house, she was unable to keep her appointment. Was any reason given?" "Her maid informed me that she was ill," Clayton replied. Which was quite true. She had just gone through a very unpleasant experience, for she had surprised her father and Moreland that evening in the library, and seen a sight she will never forget. "What was that?" "Moreland had been showing Rossiter how he deformed himself, and had not recovered his normal shape. Fortunately, neither of the men saw her, and she did not mention her discovery to them. But the shock to her nerves was so great that her health was affected for many days afterwards. She told me these facts herself yesterday, when I called upon her at Tunbridge Wells." "Why did she not give this evidence at the inquest?" the superintendent asked. "She was too upset after her father's murder to attend, or give any evidence. Had she been well enough at present, I doubt if she would have been called as a witness. The only persons whose evidence was considered to be of any value were these two gentlemen here, Mr. Clayton and Mr. McLean. Then for the second time during Mr. Clayton's connection with this mystery, his story of the dwarf was rejected as being too fantastic for belief." "If the man Moreland desired the death of his cousin, Lord Orsett, why did he not kill him in the same way that Rossiter murdered Thorndyke?" Again it was the superintendent who put the question.
"Because, in my opinion, had he done so, he could not have shifted the responsibility of the crime on to Mr. Clayton." "How was Thorndyke murdered?" McLean asked.
"By putting some of the dwarf's tabloids into the drink which he had at Gaddy's restaurant. Rossiter could not have realized how potent they were, and gave him a dose which produced a more terrible effect than he intended. I believe he only wished to render Thorndyke unconscious, so as to obtain possession of his document, knowing by that time that he had lost the case of diamonds. He did not wish to kill him, but the result of his action produced those conditions in the corpse which the medical experts were unable to diagnose at the inquest, and can easily be recognized in the body upstairs." "But how and by whom were those diamonds extracted from the parcel I found in the cab, and when were the imitation stones put in their place?" Clayton inquired. "That is what I cannot understand." "The exchange was effected by Emile Gaston, who had an exact counterfeit of it in his possession, and knew perfectly well what negotiations were going on between his master, Miles Rossiter, and Thorndyke, and, incidentally, with yourself. You gave him a lucky opportunity, which he did not fail to avail himself of." "When was that?" "It was upon the occasion when he helped you off with your coat in the hall of Christopher Moreland's flat. He knew that you were going to call, and had had the duplicate parcel ready for some time. The imitation was perfect in every respect, even to the enclosure of Miles Rossiter's card. It was a clever trick, but not a difficult one for a man like Emile Gaston to play." "You have not told us yet how Moreland managed to reduce his height by nearly 2 feet," McLean said, "as well as the other distortions of his shape. That seems to be the most uncanny part of the whole business." Greatorex looked at a paper, which had been pushed towards him by the doctor, and perused it for several moments before he answered. "This is a statement which has been drawn up by Dr. Ferguson, but it is so technical in its information that I only propose to give you an epitome of what it contains. You will have every opportunity of perusing it for yourselves later on, should you desire to do so." He took up the paper as he spoke. "It appears that, by reason of a malformation of the muscles and the tissues about his joints, which was accidental from birth, Christopher Moreland was able, without difficulty or pain, to disjoint his limbs in a way that reduced his stature by about 17 inches. Incredible as that may appear to the lay mind, this transformation from a man of normal size to that of a dwarf was as easy an action for him to perform as it is for me to raise my arm or move my legs. The doctor here, who has given all his professional life to the study of physiology, tells me that, though such a case as this has never to his knowledge been brought before the medical faculty, there is no reason why such a phenomenal condition of the human body should not happen. It is well known that some people can easily disjoint their thumbs. In the case of Christopher Moreland, he was able, with equal facility, to disjoint his hips, his knees, his ankles, and even his backbone. Dr. Ferguson tabulates the individual reductions by dislocation approximately as follows: hips, 4 inches, knees, 2 inches, ankles, 2 inches, backbone, 5 inches, general relaxation of muscles, 4 inches, total, 17 inches. I understand that by relaxing the muscles of the trunk and legs, anyone can in time shorten himself by 3 or 4 inches, but it was the dislocation of the backbone which was the strangest part of Moreland's power of deforming himself. The slipping down of the trunk between the hips and the protrusion of the abdomen intensified the unpleasant appearance of the man when transformed into a dwarf. Am I correct?" Dr. Ferguson nodded slowly in answer to the question, and looked blandly round the table. "Are you of opinion that the man Gaston was aware of his master's peculiarity in this respect?" the superintendent asked. "I do not see how he could have been ignorant of it," Greatorex replied. "Gaston is a shrewd man, and would take care to acquaint himself as far as possible with everything which concerned his master's affairs. It must have been he who assisted the dwarf to carry Mr. Clayton back to his room here, after the struggle in the drive. He was also probably an accomplice with his master in removing Thorndyke's body from Mr. Clayton's chambers in the Temple to the ground floor. He must have been aware that Christopher Moreland was the same man who occupied the opposite flat in Acton Chambers.
There can be no doubt that he was a partner in his master's crimes, the doctor said gravely, and he was probably very well paid for the job. But we have so far only discussed the means by which Moreland reduced his height, Greater X went on. We have yet to account for how he contracted the rest of his body. I was baffled by this problem during my first visit of investigation here, but my suspicions were at once aroused by that special room he built out of this house, and to which you, Mr. Clayton, were unable to admit me. I examined it carefully from the outside and noted the positions of the windows. There were 2 at each side, and 1 at the further end. By the simple process which, upon a previous occasion, had been adopted by Christopher Moreland himself, I obtained a wax impression of the keyhole, and got a duplicate key made in Ardley. Upon my second visit here, I used that key, and so obtained entrance to the room. There I found the 2 windows on either side of me, but no window at the further end. Again I took a wax impression of the keyhole. Greater X waited impressively for several moments before he continued. Only the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece was heard, and a gust of wind driving the sleet against the window glass. When eventually I entered the inner room, I was not alone. Dr. Ferguson was with me, and from that moment the mystery was solved. The apartment was little larger than this table, and it fitted up in much the same way as is a chemist's laboratory. The walls were lined with shelves, upon which were several bottles. In one corner was a sink, with hot and cold water laid on. Upon the table were a couple of glass retorts, some crucibles, and a case of testing tubes. We put the bottles in the pockets of our coats, for they were fortunately small in size and convenient in shape. The drawer of the table was locked, but we forced it open, and found there a little leather box, which we took away with us. That box was filled with white tabloids. As we were about to leave the room, I noticed a dark shadow against the wall. It was the upright framework of a door. That, gentlemen, was the most important discovery I had yet made, for it showed me at once the means by which the dwarf had escaped from Miles Rossiter's room on the occasion of the murder. The night after our return to Ardley, the doctor examined the contents of the bottles we had brought with us. He also tested the composition of those white tabloids with infinite care and patience. It was not till after midnight that he discovered they were made up of a certain medical preparation, rarely used in the Eastern Hemisphere and unknown in the West, which has the effect of drying up all the muscles and tissues in the body if taken in proper quantity. It was thus proved that after reducing his height to that of a dwarf, Moreland was able, by swallowing a couple of these tabloids, to bring the rest of his body, with the exception of his head and the framework of his chest, into almost a glutinous condition, which could pass through a very small space indeed. His appearance must have then resembled that of a balloon in human form, which was almost emptied of gas. He was able to compress himself almost flat. Last night, when we examined him in the library here, we proved that our deductions were correct, for we dislocated his limbs by force. He had, however, already discovered that the game was up, and took his life by swallowing a sufficient number of tabloids to have killed 6 men. An expression of triumph spread over the great ex-detective's face as he looked round the assembled company and noted the keen interest with which his auditors were following his remarks. "But how did the dwarf escape from Miles Rossiter's room?" Clayton asked in a hushed voice. "We followed him immediately after the shot was fired, and he certainly was not in the apartment when we searched it. Then the door was locked when we wanted to get out."
"I anticipated that question, and intended to answer it before it was asked," Greater X replied. It is the only detail of this extraordinary mystery which still requires explanation. On the occasion of my first examination of the bedrooms in this house, I noticed that the doors were all similar, with the exception of 4. The rooms were those occupied by yourself, by Christopher Moreland, the one where the murder was committed, and that outside room to which I afterwards obtained entrance. When you told me what you had heard and seen on the night of the crime, and after very carefully examining the room where the murder took place, there was only one conclusion to come to. The shot must have been fired from a spot very near to the door, and the means of escape close at hand. I examined those 4 doors minutely, but they gave me no hint of the secret they hid. It was not till I discovered that framework in Moreland's laboratory that the mystery was explained."
There was a breathless silence in the room. With irritating slowness, Greatorex removed his spectacles from his face, replaced them in their case, and put it in his pocket.
"The deep frames of those doors were of deal, painted to resemble the rest of the oaken woodwork. They were not only hollow, but the interiors of them revolved. By pressing them upon a spot about halfway up on the right-hand side, a narrow aperture was revealed, and the opening of the door mechanically turned the hidden hiding-place. The dwarf shot at the bed as soon as he entered the room, and then immediately hid himself in the framework of the door. As you entered, you revolved the narrow space in which the murderer was concealed. He merely stepped out upon the other side, and locked you into the chamber. As soon as he had recovered his normal condition, as Christopher Moreland, he coolly came and released you. Of course he thought he had killed his cousin, Lord Orsett, and did not know that the victim was his partner in crime, Miles Rossiter."
Greatorex turned dramatically and pointed to a distant corner of the room.
"There, gentlemen, is the framework of the door which the doctor and I found in the secret laboratory. If you will examine it yourselves, you will more easily understand the facts which I have been placing before you."
End of chapter 29. The Hidden Mask by Guise Mitford. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30. Nearly a couple of years have passed since the events recorded in the preceding pages, and they have certainly been the happiest in Lawrence Clayton's life. As soon as possible, after the second tragedy at the nunnery, he had left the place with Lord Orsett, who had hastily returned there after hearing of his cousin's death, and together they had joined Lady Anna and Verna Rossiter in London. By a strange sequence of circumstances already known to the reader, the huge fortune bequeathed by Miles Rossiter to Christopher Moreland had, upon the death of the latter, reverted to Lord Orsett, who, in the absence of any will, became possessed of the millionaire's wealth as the nearest relative of the deceased. Early in the following year, he married one of the best known and most popular of London hostesses. As a widow, she was still the love of his early manhood, and the same lady of whom he had spoken to Clayton during the early days of their acquaintance at the nunnery. In addition to her rank and beauty, she possessed every charm which was requisite for presiding over the great social and political functions which took place in her husband's homes, both in London and in the country. It was a sore trial to Lady Anna to be separated from her brother, but she accepted the new order of things with philosophic calm, and devoted herself more than ever to those philanthropic institutions with which she so long had been associated. She made her home in London, and Verna Rossiter was very thankful for the offer of her kind friend that she should consider it her own home as well. As Lord Orsett was able to make a very generous allowance to his sister out of his newly acquired wealth, her ladyship's house in Prince's Gate soon became one of the most popular centers of charitable activity. After Lord Orsett's marriage, Clayton continued to act as his private secretary, and the salary he received was a most liberal one. A strong friendship had become formed between the two men, partly due to their mutual interest and also to their association with the terrible events that had taken place at the nunnery. Clayton also found that his former legal training stood him in good stead in dealing with many of the business transactions in connection with his employer's estates. During the autumn, a by-election suddenly occurred in the Midland County where Lord Orsett owned much property, and where he was justly regarded as a most popular landlord. His lordship insisted upon Clayton contesting the division, and he supplied all the necessary expenses. When he was returned at the head of the poll with a substantial majority, Lord Orsett's delight was unbounded. He expressed his gratification in a princely form, and upon the day when Lawrence Clayton first took his seat in the House of Commons, he presented his secretary with a cheque for £10,000. During the year which followed the death of her father, Verna Rossiter lived a very quiet life with Lady Anna Morland. She met Clayton many times during those dreary months of mourning, though not as often as either of them could have wished. The girl did not go out into society, while a good deal of Clayton's time was spent over his secretarial work for Lord Orsett and, later on, with his own political duties. So it was not till nearly 2 years had passed that the lovers found themselves together once again in a close and unrestrained companionship. Lady Anna had brought Verna to join Lord Orsett's party upon his yacht in the Mediterranean, and to avoid the London fogs of a severe winter. The brother and sister had long ago guessed the secret which Clayton and Verna believed to be known only to themselves, and they both highly approved of the match as being in every way suitable. It was a perfect night, and the evening primrose was anchored in the exquisite bay of Naples. Far away from the dim horizon, where the blue of sky and water melted into each other, rose the faint outline of Capri, while upon the shore the lights were beginning to flicker from many a window. Downstairs in the saloon there was a party of bridge players lingering over their game, though the first gong had already sounded, summoning them to their cabins to prepare for dinner. Upon deck, in an opaline glow of the dying day, walked 2 figures, and the only sound beside their voices was the soft splash of the ripples that played against the dark hulk of the boat. Clayton felt for the hand of the woman beside him and pressed it into his palm. "Verna," he whispered, "you will marry me as soon as we get back to England. I cannot wait for you any longer." She turned and looked at him, and her fingers tightened round his. "Yes," she replied, "my life is yours now, and I will marry you as soon as we get home." He drew her close to him. "Dearest," he said, "you are giving everything, and I nothing. You are giving me yourself. And have you forgotten all that terrible past?" She shuddered. "I shall remember nothing now, except that we belong to each other." "God bless you, Verna," he whispered. Then he stooped as she lifted her lips to his. "My God, how I love you, sweetheart." The sound of voices floated up from downstairs. The game of bridge was finished, and the players were hurrying to their cabins. Another warning gong boomed its note across the water, and the still figures of a man and a woman stood in the half-light upon deck. locked in each other's arms. The sailor aft, whose business it was to keep a strict lookout, deserved promotion from that moment. He had fulfilled his duty most conscientiously, but now he suddenly turned to gaze at nothing at all in the opposite direction. Then he slowly winked at the rising moon and spat overboard. "Lucky devil," he muttered to himself. "I must tell my lass at home." End of chapter 30. End of The Hidden Mask by C. Guise Mitford. Read by Laurie Banza.